Okay, hello everyone, and welcome to this workshop, which is part of the Early Researchers Seminar organized by the Cambridge Reproduction SRI. The Cambridge Reproduction SRI is an interdisciplinary initiative that brings together researchers from across the university who have an interest in any aspect of reproduction, everything from science, technology, and medicine to arts and humanities. If you are not yet a member, you can download the membership form from the website. Now, I would like to start by thanking the volunteer coordinators for organizing the series, and indeed to all speakers for volunteering their time to be here with us. The seminars are held online on the second Thursday of each month at 1 p.m. And if anyone here who is a postgraduate student or a postdoc would like to take part, please get in touch with Christina. So my name is Rumiana Iotova, and I am from the Faculty of Law, where I work on international biomedical law and human rights. And it is my great pleasure to welcome our two speakers today. Now, our second speaker is Jinal Dadia, and she is a third-year PhD student at the Faculty of Law. She is associated with the Center for Law, Medicine and Life Sciences, as well as with the SRI. Her work relates to ART regulation and reproductive health, and she is going to talk to us about the best practices for realizing the right to reproductive health. Jinal, over to you.
Hi, thank you very much for that introduction. As Rumiana said, my name is Jinal and I'm a lawyer and a PhD student here in Cambridge, and my work relates to the regulation of assisted reproductive technologies, or as we all call them, ARTs. Now, in my PhD broadly, I claim that fertility clinics should be regulated in ways that best further the human right to reproductive health. And Article 12 of the ICSCR, which is the International Covenant of Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights, says that everyone has a right to health, including reproductive health, and that their governments should take steps towards realizing this right. So very broadly, my research tries to work out what these steps should look like when they relate to fertility clinics that provide ARTs to people. And this presentation is based on a chapter of my PhD, and it is still very much a work in progress. So all suggestions and comments are very, very welcome. Now, in this presentation, I focus on one significant aspect of the right to reproductive health, which is that of affordability. Article 12 of the ICSCR, which I have reproduced in part on this slide, recognizes a right to reproductive health. And this has been authoritatively interpreted by a general comment adopted by the Council of Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights. This is General Comment 22, parts of which are up on this slide. Now, according to it, reproductive health services should be affordable for all. Where they are essential, they should be provided free of cost at the point of use. And in all other cases, states should take steps to ensure that they are affordable and accessible without any discrimination. Means-tested support should be available to access all other reproductive health services, that is, those which are not free at the point of use. Now, there is considerable material to show that ARTs are reproductive health services and therefore subject to this regime of affordability. However, there is very little to support the claim that they are essential and should always be available for free in all cases. Now, while some states do fund ARTs for its residents, in almost no case is access to funded ARTs either unconditional or unlimited. Now, before I unpack how states should go about rationing ART funding, I want to briefly outline arguments for and against state funding. ARTs are expensive. And despite private clinics and insurers coming up with innovative ART financing schemes, as you see on the slides, they remain costly. So costly that in fact, many NHS commissioning groups have from time to time suspended ART funding in many parts of England, including in Cambridge and Peterborough next door. So while on one hand, having the option of using ARTs expands the scope of one's procreative choices, their cost significantly limits the scope within which this choice can be exercised. And as authorities responsible for bringing human rights into being, it can be argued that states should enable free access to ARTs. Now, the biggest critics of state funding argue that such funding amplifies pronatalist biases and pressures that already operate in society. Women are always viewed as having the duty to marry and create babies, especially when they fall within what is seen as a reproductive age. Increasingly, they are made to consider whether they'd like to freeze their eggs or embryos so that motherhood remains a continuing option for them. And women who find it difficult to conceive on accounts of physiological reasons or social factors such as being in same-sex relationships or being single, or even because they rather prioritize their careers or other goals, are pressured, shamed, and prejudiced. Now, people who criticize state funding on these grounds argue that in a world where ARTs were readily and freely available, involuntary childlessness would be seen as easily solvable, and this would intensify the pressure to give birth that is already faced by women. Now, however, as you can see, pronatalism on both sides is on both sides of the seesaw on this slide. And an opposite view, and one that I agree with, is that till social pronatalism is tackled, women should not be denied access to technologies that ameliorates its effects. ARTs give hope and recourse to women affected by involuntary childlessness all over our pronatalist world. And while this pronatalism doesn't go away, women should have the right to access means and technologies too, which, for want of a better word, make things easier. Thus seen, the existence of society's pronatalist biases becomes an argument in favor of ART funding and not against it. Now, another major argument against ART funding relates to the medicalization of reproduction. Broadly put, medicalization is the process whereby a social or a human problem gets defined as a medical one, which is to be managed or treated medically. And scholars describe medicalization as the process through which the medical profession itself defines the boundaries of a problem and decides how it should be solved. That said, medicalization is not always a bad thing. However, in the context of ARTs, it poses some serious challenges, as I will outline in the next few slides. And through this, I argue that a reproductive health approach to determining how ARTs are funded can resolve some challenges of such medicalization. Now, finally, most governments simply just don't have money needed for universal funding. And in this presentation, I recommend a reproductive health approach in which limited resources can be rationed in a means-tested and non-discriminatory manner. So the process I use to work out a reproductive health approach to funding ARTs is a comparative one. I compare 4 representative models of how ARTs are actually funded. And these are those of England, Ontario, Singapore, and the state of Maharashtra in India. England follows a medical need-based problem, where it is primarily individuals who are proven to be medically infertile who can access funded fertility care on the NHS. Gamete freezing is only funded when there is a fear of fertility being compromised on account of treatments such as chemotherapy. In Maharashtra and India, on the other hand, not only would you have to prove that you are medically infertile, but also that you belong to a group that deserves protection for reasons such as poverty or dwindling numbers. Now, the scenario is slightly different in Ontario, where everyone below a certain age who wants to access ARTs can access up to 1 round of it under the Ontario Fertility Program. In Singapore as well, ART subsidies are available for couples without having to establish medical infertility, but these are only restricted to heteronormative married couples. Now, a review of all 4 models shows that some common themes determine who can access state-funded fertility care in most countries. One of these is that of medical need, which affects questions of ART funding in different ways in the, given jurisdictions, and I will discuss them in the next few slides. Now, medical need becomes relevant at two levels. The first is while answering the question of whether fertility care should be funded at all. And the second is at the level of whether a specific individual or couple's care should be funded. Now, the first question relies on whether doctors and policymakers think of infertility as a disease. If infertility is a disease, then the state should spend taxpayer money on curing it as it does any other disease. So in England, the NICE makes recommendations on when medical procedures such as an appendectomy or hip replacements should be funded on the NHS. And my review of the NICE's guidelines and documents leading up to them shows that the NICE views infertility as a disease affecting the reproductive system, and therefore individuals suffering from that disease can access an optimum set of state funding ARTs. In this, ARTs compete with other medical procedures such as hip replacements to be funded. Now, this has specific budgetary implications in England. Here, at the local level, it is clinical commissioning groups or CCGs who make decisions on what should be funded by NHS clinics. Each CCG is assigned a budget based on where it is located to spend on all medical services needed in that area. Now, typically, CCGs located in areas with higher, older, or vulnerable populations are better funded, and areas with young populations have lower funding. Oxford and Cambridge, for instance, have some of the lowest CCG funding in England. As a result, areas with higher number of people within reproductive ages receive very limited NHS funding overall. This makes CCGs in these areas less likely to fund ARTs. In Maharashtra, in India, on the other hand, regulators are of the opinion that ARTs are not medically needed in a way that warrants funding. Indian insurance regulators also clarify that medical insurance should not typically cover ARTs as they are not medically essential in the way other treatments are. Contrastingly, in Ontario, the question of whether ARTs are medically needed has very limited bearing on whether they should be funded at all. While medical need was one of the arguments that led to the state's ART funding program, it was not the sole argument on which it was based. In fact, Ontario's decision to fund ARTs corresponded to their removal from the list of insured medical services under Ontario's health insurance program. Now, if we see medicalization as the process of defining a human problem as a medical one, this delisting perhaps shows a reversal of this process. It made ARTs a non-medical healthcare entitlement available to all, subject to a cap of a total 12,000 cycles in the province. Separate budgetary allocations were made to the Ontario Fertility Program, and so ARTs no longer had to compete with other medical services to be funded. Singapore also does not base its decision on medical need. However, medical savings accounts can be used to pay for ARTs. Now, drawing from all of this, the treatment of medical need in these jurisdictions informs our discussion on medicalization in two ways. First, it highlights the role of the medical profession in defining infertility and gatekeeping access to it. This, as I have shown, can be unreliable. In England and in Maharashtra, regulators come to differing conclusions on whether ARTs are medically needed enough to be funded. But in Ontario and Singapore, where the decision is not as highly medicalized, access is more universally affordable. Second, the medicalization of ARTs results in their having to compete with other medical services for funding. They stop being specific individual entitlements as guaranteed by a right to reproductive health framework. Now, in my paper, I suggest that the NHS ring-fence specific healthcare funds for ARTs alone, thereby delivering them from competition with other medical treatments. Now, at the second level, ARTs also determine whether specific individuals and couples can, medicalization also determines whether specific individuals and couples can access ARTs. In England, the NICE guidelines require individuals or couples to be diagnosed as being medically or physiologically infertile to access IVF funding. For heterosexual couples, this is an intense medical process stretched out over 2 years. It involves rounds of counseling and testing before they can access IVF. Where it is possible, they are managed through other treatments such as gonadotropin drugs. Same-sex couples have to self-fund up to 2 rounds of AI unsuccessfully before they can access NHS-funded rounds. Egg freezing is only funded for individuals anticipating a loss of fertility on medical grounds. In Ontario, on the other hand, people do not need to undergo a diagnostic process to access funded ARTs. In Singapore, an infertility diagnosis is again not a precondition to access ARTs, but medical risks can disqualify couples from such access. Now, interestingly, in India, only individuals and couples belonging to specific groups can access funded ARTs. However, once group membership is established, medical need becomes relevant. For instance, couples belonging to the dwindling but overall wealthy Parsi community must establish financial need, a heteronormative marital relationship, as well as a medical diagnosis of infertility to access ART funding. Now, group-based access is one way to achieve means-tested affordability in low-resource contexts. Nevertheless, when the medical needs of some groups takes precedence over others, it indicates that their medical needs are more important than those of others, and this is discriminatory. Now, this treatment of medical need at the second level of consideration further informs our discussion on medicalization in significant ways. Once again, we see the medical community gatekeeping access to ARTs in ways that limit individuals' reproductive autonomy. In England and in India, the diagnostic process has been shown to be harmful to the mental and emotional health of prospective patients. Medical gatekeeping also means that same-sex couples and single women are denied access to ARTs, as is the case in England, and this is discriminatory. In Singapore and India, however, this discrimination is on grounds of other factors and not medicalization. In Ontario, where medical need plays a very restricted role in determining access, the rules are not discriminatory at all. Now, drawing from this discussion, I recommend an alternative reproductive health approach to ART funding. I claim that this enables affordability while addressing some challenges of medicalization. This is primarily on account of how reproductive health is defined. The WHO and various other international bodies define reproductive health as not merely the absence of diseases, but affecting the reproductive system, but also overall reproductive wellness of an individual. As a result, a service does not need to classify as a medical necessity in order to be a healthcare entitlement. This expands the scope of access to assisted reproduction to those experiencing involuntary childlessness for any reason, and not just physiologically diagnosed infertility. Now, non-discrimination is an important element of the right and its affordability, and therefore, I recommend that same-sex couples and single women are not directly or indirectly discriminated against while accessing ARTs. My recommendations draw considerably from the Ontario model and its treatment of medical needs. I make specific suggestions for changes in the jurisdictions I consider. In the case of England, I recommend that the NHS adopt a ring-fenced budget for funding ARTs, as it already does for some types of cancer treatment. I also recommend that infertility-based diagnostic requirements not be mandatory, where ART seekers don't wish to go through them. In India, I recommend that medical need-based criteria be abandoned in favor of a more strongly means-tested one. Now, obviously, all this needs a lot of money, which governments often don't have. And so they have to adopt principles and policy to ration limited funds among all prospective parents. Now, up until now, I argued that medical needs should not be the principle on which this money is rationed. Now I briefly turn towards alternatives to make ART more cost-effective. Different countries have worked out different formulae to figure out the extent to which fertility care is cost-effective. England, for instance, uses a mathematical calculation of QALYs to determine cost-effectiveness, whereas other jurisdictions have less sophisticated formulae. Now, the choice of method has some significant consequences. First, it was cost effectiveness that paved the way for the establishment of Ontario's fertility program. In discussions leading up to its adoption, the government considered costs of managing the medical consequences of ARTs when they were procured by their residents who went to other jurisdictions as medical tourists and then came back to Ontario to rely on its health insurance for treatment. They compared this to the cost of funding ARTs. And it was found that funding 5,000 then and now up to 12,000 rounds of ARTs a year would actually save the government money, therefore prompting its establishment. But more specifically, quality-based calculations in England result in more cost-effective services being funded over less cost-effective ones. So the NICE notes that IUI is often followed up with IVF, and therefore IUI by itself is not generally offered by the NHS here. Similarly, GIFT and ZIFT are considered less cost-effective than IVF, and so they are not offered either. At the same time, cost-effectiveness calculations are used to work out how many rounds of IVF or other services are offered. To maximize everyone's chances of having a baby, often 1 to 3 rounds are offered to people as recommended by medical experts. Since reproductive health relates to giving individuals the best chance that they can have of having healthy babies, such calculations, when they fall within the right to reproductive health approach that I recommend, are useful. Ontario specifically offers less effective options and fewer rounds to a larger number of people. And I recommend altering this to match the NHS recommendation so as to make it more cost effective. However, in some instances, cost effectiveness calculations can be discriminatory. So in England, where the benefits of IVF are calibrated with how much it will improve a prospective patient's life, parents' life, older women are not offered IVF on the NHS. The stated idea being that women over 40 or 41 just don't have long enough to live, and therefore their lives will not be improved enough to justify the high costs of IVF. Now, this is different from IVF being denied to older women on grounds of medical risk, and there are other regulatory tools to manage that. When this is a funding condition, it discriminates against older women on grounds of age, which is inconsistent with the right to reproductive health. My overall recommendation then is that cost effectiveness should not be a goal in itself, but instead should be in furtherance of the right to reproductive health. And means testing is another way in which it can be achieved. So finally, I want to point out that the reproductive health framework is not the only rights framework that can guide ART regulation. There are often very compelling reasons for countries to base their regulatory frameworks on other values and principles. And so the recommendations that I make are subject to the choices and contexts in which governments continue to regulate. Now, here are some quick thoughts on what I propose to look at in my upcoming research. And with this, I've come to an end. Thank you very much for coming. And I would love to hear your thoughts and questions on any of this. Thank you.